We've been talking about development theory, and it's, I think, reasonable at this point to be pretty pessimistic about the state of development theory and efforts to combat poverty. After all, the World Bank was created back at the end of World War II. It had this sort of mission of ending poverty globally. If we look around, we see that poverty is still a problem globally. And if we even track the sort of evolution of development thinking, it moves from thinking that we can just simply throw money at a problem to trying to throw money at specific actors to trying to figure out how to incentivize money to sort of flow into developing countries. And as development theory evolves, keeps trying to solve a problem, but the overall solution of ending poverty really doesn't seem to get addressed. And so again, there's, I think, reason for pessimism, but there's also reason for optimism. And this comes in a development in the last decade or so in which we've really rethought what it means to combat poverty globally. So in the 1990s, the World Bank looked at what it had been doing and said, we're just simply not getting at the problem. We're not addressing poverty the way that we need to. And maybe having economists with PhDs, primarily from wealthy countries, craft solutions to poverty in developing countries isn't the right way to go about this. Maybe there's something that we don't understand about poverty. And so the World Bank goes back to the drawing board and they conduct a massive global study called the Voices of the Poor Project, in which they interview 60,000 people in developing countries. They go out and find the poorest of the poor. And some of these interviews are, structured interviews where you get a questionnaire and you ask questions like, how frequently do you skip meals? Or, how do you get access to transportation? Or, what's your access to birth control? But a lot of it's also these unstructured interviews where they just talk to people about their lives and find out what are the problems they're facing and how do things work and how do they solve problems and do what they need to do in life. And then all that gets compiled into this project, this series, Voices of the Poor, which is, I think 6 or 7 different books. You can download them all off of the World Bank website. I grabbed a chapter on health and threw that up on Blackboard for you. But it really draws attention to just the desperation at the very bottom rung of the global ladder, where there isn't work. Traditional patterns of living no longer seem to operate the way that they did before. There's a sense of hopelessness that nobody really cares and there's no one to work with to even solve problems. And then you get this sort of variation. Even on the bottom rung of the global economic ladder, poverty really hits women and children the hardest. And the picture that's painted is where the limited resources that are available end up going to address the needs of men, right? So if a man gets sick, he gets medicine. If a child gets sick, the child dies. And then the pervasiveness of violence and the pervasiveness of hopelessness and depression, and how it paints a picture of women really being the ones who are holding society together and making sure that things actually happen and get done. And so once you start thinking about poverty in sort of a broader, the crisis of daily life and the hardships that are experienced at the bottom rung of the global economic ladder, then simply increasing wages or ramping up GDP per capita becomes sort of a very callous way of thinking about responding to the problem of poverty. And so all across the development community, there shifts thinking away from ramping up GDP per capita to thinking about poverty in a completely different way. They're thinking about poverty as improving the quality of life for people. And so there's actually, this started in Bhutan, where the king of Bhutan said that his country is not going to track gross domestic product, but instead they're going to track gross domestic happiness. And initially economists sort of laughed and said, oh, that's silly. We're trying to make people happy when we really should be making people rich. And then they paused for a second and realized that no, actually getting people to be happy with life and improving quality of life so that things are not as miserable is actually a really noble goal. And so there's been shifting, how do we measure improving quality of life? And one measure that you can look at for this is the Human Development Index. This is something that the United Nations has been tracking for a number of years, and it looks at 3 different factors. It looks at GDP per capita, right? Income per person, and says, yeah, income is an important part of quality of life, but it's not the be-all and end-all. In fact, we're going to create a diminishing return, a decay effect, after about $10,000 to $12,000. And so here's the logic. If you go from $1 a day, 365 bucks a year, to $2 a day, right? $700, $800, $1,000 a year, that's a huge jump in quality of life. That goes from, going to bed hungry every night to not going to bed hungry every night. If you double that again and you go from $1,000 a year GDP per capita to $2,000 a year GDP per capita, that's a huge increase in human well-being. That means that, when somebody gets sick, they get medicine, or maybe your community has enough to be able to put in place a pump with sanitation for the water supply. Huge gains in quality of life. If you go to $4,000, suddenly kids are able to go to school and people are able to almost start saving a little bit. When you go from 10,000 to 20,000, we're talking about maybe a car versus a motorbike. 20,000 to 40,000, we're talking about longer vacations. The jumps in quality of life really start getting not insignificant, but not as substantial, right? As going from, I went to bed hungry every night, I doubled my income, and now I don't go to bed hungry every night. And so they say, okay, GDP per capita matters, but after about 10 to 12,000, we're just not going to pay attention anymore because it's not as important a factor. Other things matter more. So those other things they capture with two measures. One is literacy rate, right? What percent of the population can actually read, and the other is life expectancy. And on the surface, those might not seem like the super important things you would want to track, but when we step back and think about what goes into literacy rates and what goes into life expectancy, they're actually really good proxy measures for a whole bunch of other stuff that matters, right? And so if literacy rates are high, that sort of suggests that government services are operating, right? And that they're operating across an entire society, and that people aren't falling through the cracks, that people are able to get access to government services. And that's a huge thing in terms of quality of life and in terms of reaching the poorest of the poor out there in the rural and remote parts of a country. So literacy rate is a good stand-in for societies working and meeting the needs of people. Life expectancy is getting at some of that, right? If your sanitation system is in place, if your healthcare and hospitals systems are in place, if your emergency response systems are in place, but also if your country is not being riven by war, that's also going to sort of boost up life expectancy. And so what we see is that places where things are working, life expectancy goes up. Places where things are really awful and falling apart and governments aren't functioning and people are experiencing really serious hardships, that's where life expectancies are low. And so when we take these three things together, we can get a picture of quality of life that's much more nuanced than just how rich are you. And so when we think about the Human Development Index, what we see is that there's interesting variation across the planet, right? As you might expect, right? North America and Western Europe are doing pretty well, but Latin America is also doing reasonably well, as is the former Soviet Union, and Saudi Arabia, which is actually quite wealthy, isn't doing nearly as well as you might think. The hardest hit parts of the world are concentrated in South Asia and that sort of tropical region of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in the central part of Africa really is experiencing the worst hardship in terms of quality of life, in terms of services working, in terms of life expectancy, and in terms of just economic opportunity. Okay, so one of the things that happens when we shift our focus away from just thinking about maximizing GDP to improving quality of life is that gives us other things to aim for. And so in the late 1990s, the United Nations developed a new plan for combating poverty globally called the Millennium Development Goals. And the idea was that they would track 48 measurable objectives, things that they could target, things that they could go after, organized across 7 or 8 different general areas that they wanted to focus on, and that they would try to make significant progress on these 48 different things by the year 2015. We're just past that 2015. The Millennium Development Goal approach was so successful that the United Nations sort of re-upped it with Sustainable Development Goals, which is a very similar set of metrics, but is pushing us through into the 2030s, I think. And the idea was that this would be a holistic approach, right? So we're going to tackle poverty not just by throwing money at the problem, but by thinking about all the different aspects of life and how to improve quality of life. And it's going to integrate the efforts of the United Nations, the World Bank, all these different NGOs that are out there, things like the World Health Organization or the World Food Program, as well as getting wealthy countries that provide a lot of the cash for poverty alleviation programs to really target their efforts at these specific different areas, right? And to kind of give you a sense of what this looks like, I did my best to dig through reports a few years ago and try and get a sense of where the Millennium Development Goals were at. And so you can look at this and say, okay, so one of their goals is reducing poverty, and they're looking at that as poverty and hunger. And one of the metrics that they're tracking is the percent of the population living on $1.25 a day. That's sort of the poorest of the poor. There's about 1 billion people in this category, and the goal is to sort of get that down. And so if you track where that number was in 1990 versus 2005, and then the red line represents sort of the target that was set with the Millennium Development Goals, they're not there in 2005. They end up losing a lot of their progress with the Great Recession, but they're back to about where they were in 2005 now. But they didn't make it quite to their goal, but they made huge gains compared to where we were in 1990. And so that's a really important development, because this was a highly ambitious goal. They were far away from their target of the red line, and they made substantial progress toward it. Other goals were not quite as ambitious. So if we look at gender equality, some of those jumps from where we were in the 1990s to where we wanted to be at the end of the Millennium Development Goals, there wasn't such a big gap between where we were and the red line. But we're seeing progress, because if you push in these specific areas, if you work at achieving these goals, you can make real progress. Combating HIV/AIDS, President Bush pushed a ambitious agenda to get anti-HIV, anti-AIDS drugs out to particularly Africa, and had a huge effect at reducing the spread and controlling HIV across the world. And so when you make a push, you can achieve those goals. And what I would point out that I think is really fascinating is that there was a call for an ambitious increase. This is that bottom one, the global partnership, increasing development assistance. It said, really ramp that development assistance up, and we'll be able to make a difference. Essentially, the world didn't respond. There wasn't a ramp up in development assistance. And so the gains that we're seeing across these different categories really reflect just targeted efforts, using the exact same resources we had, but saying these are the things that matter, these are the things that we're going to push at, and really seeing progress across those different measures. So in spite of several discussions here that suggest that poverty alleviation is a really impossible task, when we look at the data from the Millennium Development Goals, it suggests to us that if we try, we can make progress. And if there were resources to follow, it's quite possible that we could actually make a real difference in terms of combating poverty globally.